for that introduction, and thank you for allowing me to talk about something that I'm very passionate about. In fact, I went through my CV last night to see when I first started talking about this. It was in 2011, and that's when ASN was at experimental biology, to give you an idea how long ago that was. So I like to talk about this, and I really like to talk about lutein and zeaxanthin, and I have been studying it for about 30 years. And I often wonder, did I pick lutein or did lutein and zeaxanthin pick me? Because if you think about it, it's often abbreviated as L/Z, which is Liz. So anyway, that's what I'm here to talk about. Okay, so what my disclosures, I consult with Bausch & Lomb, and I am now the editor-in-chief of the brand new publication from ILSI, the Global Perspectives on Nutrition. So take a look out for that, okay? Okay, so let's talk about lutein. Where do you find it? The green leafy vegetables. And it's a carotenoid. And what makes lutein so interesting to talk about is because in nature, we have hundreds, 700 at least, of carotenoids. So think about a New England autumn. Those leaves turn red and orange and yellow. Those are all carotenoids. There's hundreds of them. But in our diet, there's maybe around 20, maybe. In our body, we have really 5 major ones. But in our macula, which is a portion, I want to step away from this. I like to, in our macula, so you got your eyeball, right? And in the back of your eyeball, you got your retina. And in your retina, centrally located is your macula. So I'm looking at Michael right now through my macula. All right? But when you think about that, with decades of light exposure. So as we get old, we got that direct hit of light, right? So that's going to be the most vulnerable part of the retina to light damage. Right here, that's your macula. So a major cause of visual impairment among the elderly is age-related macular degeneration. And unlike cataracts, you just pop the lens out, you get a new one. You can't do anything once you got the macular degeneration. So the idea is, how can we prevent it or at least delay the progression? And that's where lutein comes in. And that's why it's so interesting, because I told you about the hundreds of carotenoids in nature. This is your retina, not yours, but and so here's the light coming in. Here's the retina. Right here you have this yellow. So this is centrally located. Yellow pigment, photoreceptors, blue light, visible light comes in. That yellow pigment grabs that blue light to protect the underlying photoreceptors. So what's so compelling about this is, what is this yellow pigment? It's lutein. It's lutein and its isomer zeaxanthin. And they get concentrated here to about 500 times more than anywhere else in the body. So now we have biological plausibility for lutein being important for visual function, because you find it concentrated where it needs to be to protect us from light damage. Okay, so this next slide, these guidelines might be better to look at. So I want you to look there, centrally, look center, keep looking, keep looking. Anybody see anything? Maybe these are better to look at. You see something? No.
A dot, a lighter dot?
Yeah.
Circle.
That's your macular pigment. Oh. So if you didn't see it, stay till the end. Okay, so that's macular pigment. So now we're talking about should we make a recommendation, a guidance for it? And when we think about nutrients, there's a couple criteria we think about. We can't synthesize it in the body in adequate amounts in the body, and it's required for normal body function. So how does lutein fit into this? Well, let's talk about you can't make it in the body. And what these slides show, this is a study we did. DSM actually helped us out with this study, where we wanted to look at the role of lutein and zeaxanthin in visual function. So unlike your rabbit, your mouse, your rat, your gerbil, they don't have a macula. So we have to study a primate, a non-human primate. And these were monkeys that were very unique because they never ate a carotenoid in their life. Their mothers never ate a carotenoid in life. So they were a blank slate as far as macular pigment. That's what we call lutein and zeaxanthin in the macula. So here are those monkeys. We took their retinas and analyzed them for carotenoids. You don't see anything. They're not making it. These are the same types of monkeys, and they, on the chow diet, which is fruits and vegetables, they have lutein, zeaxanthin, and an isomer of zeaxanthin. Those are the three carotenoids that make up macular pigment. And when we took these monkeys that never ate a carotenoid in their life and fed them either pure zeaxanthin or pure lutein, voila, it shows up in the macula. So there, we fit that criteria. The body doesn't make it. Okay, so what's next? Required normal body function. I guess that's why I'm here today. So I'm really going to focus on visual function, which makes sense, right? Here you have this dietary component that gets preferentially taken up to where it needs to be. Let's talk about visual function. Well, I can't compete with a busy slides, but it is kind of busy, but it's just to impress on you that work has been done in this area with the randomized controlled trials in healthy adults. And that's important because when you want to talk about guidance, you really want to talk about a generally healthy population. So these are all adults ranging from middle-aged to older adults, be intervening with around 10 to 12 milligrams a day of lutein and zeaxanthin. And to give you an idea about how much that is, you know those packages of frozen spinach? You buy a 10-ounce package of those. That's going to be, if you ate like 1 to 2 ounces a day, that's going to give you about that much, about 2 ounces of frozen spinach, that much. But problem is most people don't get that. But anyway, it's a dietary level, these supplementation studies. And they looked at various measures of visual function. These are routine measures that you can get clinically: visual acuity, contrast sensitivity, glare sensitivity. And that's important too when you want to make guidance. You want to have some clinical measures that are routinely done. And what we find in all these studies is that indeed you did get improvement in visual function in healthy adults. That's good. So now we're going to get to what do we do? We have some evidence to support lutein being important for visual function in healthy people. And so what I'm doing is going through, you guys familiar with this? This was a 2014 that came out. Looking at this question, let's look at what kind of criteria do we need to support guidance for a bioactive. And so I took that criteria and I'm going to go through it with you, okay? But it looks long, but we'll get through it, don't worry. So, and actually some of this was in our talk previous to this, where she had her 4 points, and a lot of those are covered in this list. So first, do we know what we call it? Unlike cinnamon, we know what we mean when we say lutein, right? So that's good, we got that checked off. Do we know how to analyze it? Are we consistent in analyzing it? If I measure it in Boston, am I getting those same measures in Wisconsin in Sherry's lab? And we do. We have standards for how to do that. So that's good. Do we have a database? And that's something we talked about today, databases. So we had that Food Data Central. If you plug in lutein into that database, you get about 10,000, 11,000 foods that will have values for lutein / zeaxanthin. So that's good. Oops, there it is. So do we have the prospective cohort studies? And this was a review from Andy Taylor, or Alan Taylor's lab at Tufts, where they actually did a review on, we're just focusing on this side. And these are those prospective studies in both diet and serum looking at the risk of cataract. And so we have evidence support that lutein is important for visual health as far as protection from cataract. What do we know about the digestion, absorption, how the body treats lutein? And we reviewed that as far as what happens in a review article I wrote with John Erdman, many of you know, and Nancy Marin. Yeah, and so we know a lot about lutein. I mean, it's on those lipoproteins. That's the only way you're going to find it. And how it's going to get to tissues. So we know a lot about how the body handles this bioactive. What about efficacy and dose response? So I hopefully convinced you about efficacy in that earlier slide on these randomized controlled trials in visual function. And we know a lot about dose response as well. So this is work that the National Eye Institute put out when they were designing their ARIDS-2 study, their age-related eye disease study that included lutein and zeaxanthin. And they wanted to know more about that dose response when it comes to how much should they put in that intervention. And you see, these are serum responses using 2.5, 5, or 10 milligrams of lutein for 6 months. And you do clearly see a dose response. More importantly, I think, is when you look at a dose response, what's happening in the macula. So John Landerman, Richard Bone, who really were pioneers in the research on lutein and zeaxanthin and macular pigment, they did the same. They looked at this dose response in serum. So the black is free values. The lighter color is what happens after you supplement with various doses of lutein. But look what happens in the macula, a clear dose response. So we got that to support guidance for lutein and recommendation. Oh, okay. So the next criteria is safety. That was mentioned earlier. What do we know about safety? And what I did, I dug through the literature to see all these various supplementation studies, how much they were giving, how long they were giving, and there were any indication of any safety issues. So first of all, looking at NHANES, as I mentioned earlier, these supplementation studies, they were high, but most people don't get that amount. But if you look at the 99th percentile of NHANES, people will be taking in 12 to 14 milligrams a day. And I think it's probably going up because unlike in 1994 with my first publication on lutein, I was measuring those HPLCs, and throughout those decades, I could slowly see that peak in people's serum of lutein going up and up and up. So they are more aware that lutein's out there and may be important. So I think one of the more important studies that I looked at that had looked at lutein supplementation and high dosages with no adverse effects. One of the more important is the ARIDS-2 study, which I mentioned earlier. It was 12 milligrams a day for 5 years, and they didn't report any signs that this was going to be a problem. So we have information on the safety of lutein. Do we have systematic reviews and meta-analyses? That's the tip of the triangle when it comes to the strength of the evidence. We have one that's been out there for AMD, age-related macular degeneration, and lutein and zeaxanthin intake. And you do see that there is a decreased risk into late stages of AMD. But as I mentioned earlier, we're really interested in healthy populations. And so so this one is looking at lutein xanthophyll, which is lutein zeaxanthin. There's a class of carotenoids, and looking at that on outcomes of those in healthy people with and without eye disease. And they found that lutein and zeaxanthin intake increased that macular pigment, that in the retina where it's protective against light damage. And that macular pigment was related to decreased photoreceptor recovery. So think about a blinding light and how long it takes you to recover from being exposed to that light. we got that. And they also looked at visual acuity, a routine clinical measure, and they found that enhanced visual acuity was enhanced in response to that lutein zeaxanthin-rich food or supplement. But that was in patients with eye diseases. And as I mentioned, we're really talking about healthy people when we want to make this guidance. And so what this is that same study looking at that photo stress recovery in both healthy and people with eye disease. They didn't do a subgroup analysis for healthy participants, and they didn't include two other studies that looked at the same outcome. So that's something that would need more attention. Now, this is a study, a meta-analysis that I did along with Gary Rahman, and she's the one that was leading that effort on the flavin-3-ols meta-analyses, for which guidance resulted for the flavin-3-ols. And what we did, we wanted to look at macular pigment and its relationship to visual outcomes, visual function outcomes in healthy people. And so we looked at all the data, all the RCTs we did, and in healthy people, looking at these clinical measures of visual function. And what we found is that indeed we did find this association between macular pigment and visual function in healthy adults. And those measures were photostress recovery, glare disability, and contrast sensitivity. So these are all things that kind of get worse as you get older. So there's good reason to believe that it makes a difference. So we made that link of macular pigment and visual function. And so really the concern is what dietary intake of lutein is it going to take to get to that visual function, that better visual function. So one way to think about this, one approach to take may be to look at what amount of lutein would it take to get that macular pigment measure that's made for visual function. So the last criteria that Lutein et al. Used, which I think is the most important, is does it make sense? Is there biologic plausibility for lutein and zeaxanthin being important for visual function? And so I believe we have it. So the first piece of evidence is work that Paul Bernstein conducted. And he's been in the carotenoid world forever, but he's also been in the ocular health world forever. And so he recognized this macular pigment preferentially being found in this portion of the retina that's important to be protected from light damage. And so he spent, I think, about 15 years trying to figure this out and found eventually that this star D3 protein is a lutein binding protein in the macula of the primate, because they're the ones that have a macula. And it was responsible for that preferential uptake of lutein. So I think that's biological plausibility. Now, getting back to those monkeys I mentioned early on, those xanthophyll-free monkeys, they were further studied to look at these cells that are in the macula, centrally located, and what these retinal pigment epithelial cells are responsible for is nutrition coming in, nutrients coming in, and waste products going out. So they're really important for the health of the retina. And what they found was, okay, so here's the retina, light coming in, centrally located. Here's those monkeys that never got the carotenoid. You see this dip. So there's a disturbance in the distribution because normally you have a peak in the center. So something's going on with the distribution of these very important retinal cells when you don't get lutein. But what happens when you give it to these monkeys? We see a repair. So again, the blue is those with the dip, those that never got those xanthophylls in their life. Give back that lutein and you actually repair the distribution of these very important cells in the retina. Biological plausibility. So this is the part of the study that I was involved in where we looked at these same monkeys and we looked at blue light damage, blue light, visible light damage. And we looked what happened when they were treated with some blue light. And in this study, what happened was, here's your fovea. This is a part of the retina. And the macula is located in the fovea, right? So this is where you're going to have your macular pigment. Outside of the fovea, you're not going to find a lot of these xanthophylls, a lot of lutein, a lot of the zexin. So they don't have that protection from blue light. And so they were treated then with the blue light. And I'll walk you through this. So here's the exposure to blue light. And here's that size of the lesion. The bigger the lesion, the more damage. So here's your fovea, where your macular pigment is. And here's your parafovea, where there's no macular pigment. So for a given exposure of light, you have less damage with that macular pigment, okay? And that makes sense, right? From what we know, lutein absorbs that blue light, so it can't go on to damage the retinal tissue underneath. So let's look at those monkeys then that were supplemented with lutein and zeaxanthin. I don't know how well you guys can see this, but so those lower ones, that's both the control monkeys, so they were eating a chow diet, and then those that were supplemented with either lutein and zeaxanthin. So those are the two lines that are less slanted. And then those xanthophylл-free monkeys, you see that they had more damage for a given amount of light exposure. So again, there's biological plausibility for lutein being important in the retina. So what did that tell you? So it says, one, we got that specific binding protein for lutein in a primate retina. I also told you that in the absence of lutein in the diet results in impaired distribution of those retinal pigment epithelial cells, as well as you get increased light damage in the retina. But when you add it back, you can actually repair those effects. So that seems pretty important. So while there's no recommended daily allowance for lutein, positive effects for eye disease, and that was with macular degeneration, Joanne Seddon found that in 1994, it was about 6 milligrams a day for use pound protection. The problem is a lot of people in the US aren't getting that amount. This is work that we did looking at lutein and zeaxanthin intake separately. The databases have them together, but we wanted to see if you tease them apart, is it different? And it's, first of all, the scale is in micrograms. So this is about 2 milligrams. That's about 0.2 milligrams. And you go throughout the lifespan, the average amount people are getting in the US is under 2 milligrams. So there's a gap there. So that too gives, it supports the idea that we do need guidance for people to understand that lutein may be important for healthy eyes. So here we go. So even at the 95th percentile, that's about when you're getting the amount that epidemiology suggests is important. But the 50th percentile is about 1. It's 1 to 2, really. So it's low. People aren't really eating green leafy vegetables. So if you didn't see that dot, here's what you can do. It's going to be your green leafy vegetables, and you cook them. That's even better. One thing I'd like to mention is this idea of bioavailability. We've done studies with avocado, pistachio, and egg. They're all good. They are all sources of lutein and zeaxanthin, but not a lot. But come to ASN, you'll see what happens when you eat pistachios every day. It just skyrockets. It's amazing. And when we did the math, we did a study with older women, 12 milligrams a day, 4 months. And then we compared those results with an avocado, 0.5 milligram a day, 6 months. When you do the math, avocado was like 20 times better as far as how much that macular pigment went up. So that's other things to consider. So there's a variety of foods that can help you to get there. So I'm done. So there you go. Thank you.